The 1990s were a golden age of Cartoon Network chaos where censorship was minimal and weirdness reigned supreme, but not all shows survived the march of time. Some were too bizarre, too offensive, or too edgy for modern TV. Today we count down 20 forgotten Cartoon Network cartoons from the 1990s that would absolutely never air today. Number 20. The Secret Files of the Spy Dog, 1995. Before there was James Bond Jr. or Spy Kids, there was The Secret Files of the Spy Dog, an espionage parody series about a genetically enhanced dog named Max who worked as an undercover agent for a secret government organization. The show was an odd mix of slapstick humor, spy tropes, and a talking dog who somehow remained emotionless through it all. Despite having all the right ingredients, action, comedy, and talking animals, the series never found an audience. The animation was crude, and the humor, though zany, felt forced. Episodes often relied on tired spy cliches and a talking dog that never really added anything to the story except a confused look. Max's missions were filled with absurd villains and even more absurd gadgets, but the show couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a tired knockoff of Inspector Gadget, except with a much less charismatic lead. If aired today, Spy Dog would probably be seen as an outdated relic of the 90s, full of poorly executed gags and a plot that never took off. With modern audiences craving more sophisticated, character-driven stories or high-quality animation, this one would be lost in the shuffle, barely remembered except for its brief stint in Cartoon Network's early lineup. Number 19. O Canada, 1997. Cartoon Network was not always about loud colors and zany slapstick. In the late 1990s, it quietly aired a series called O Canada during late-night programming blocks. The show consisted of short, animated films imported from Canada's National Film Board, most of which were surreal, emotional, or downright dark. These weren't typical kid cartoons. These were art house vignettes filled with loneliness, melancholy, and sometimes mature themes. O Canada aired stories with no dialogue, just haunting visuals and experimental sound design. Some shorts touched on death, isolation, aging, and anxiety. The series often used crude animation or abstract visuals that disturbed more than entertained. One memorable short titled The Big Snit dealt with a domestic argument as the world ends from nuclear war. Others explored themes of gender identity, war trauma, or parental neglect. Though artistically valuable, O Canada was the opposite of what kids expected from Cartoon Network. Imagine airing a somber animation about existential dread between Looney Tunes and Scooby-Doo reruns. It was baffling then and impossible now. O Canada disappeared quietly and has never been rebroadcast. In today's climate, where networks carefully curate tone and content, O Canada's quiet dread and artistic despair would be deemed too niche, too risky, and way too emotionally raw for modern airwaves. Number 18. Big Bag, 1996. Produced by Children's Television Workshop in collaboration with Cartoon Network, Big Bag was a bold experiment in live-action puppetry and animated storytelling. Aimed at preschoolers, it followed Chelly, the puppet shop owner, and Bag, a literal talking bag, as they explored life lessons through a variety of shorts, including foreign cartoons and educational segments, but the show's tone was all over the place. Big Bag felt like someone mashed up Sesame Street, Pee-wee's Playhouse, and public access television into one strange half-hour. The puppets veered into uncanny territory, and the animated shorts often came from international sources featuring deeply stylized animation and themes far more complex than typical preschool fare. One segment about a talking pencil tackled artistic jealousy and emotional manipulation. Another short used surreal claymation to explore loneliness in a city. It was not exactly bubblegum material for toddlers. Big Bag's inconsistent tone and sometimes unsettling presentation make it feel wildly out of place by modern standards. It disappeared from syndication almost entirely and remains a lost piece of Cartoon Network history. The inclusion of global animation was ahead of its time, but would be far too challenging and unconventional for today's polished preschool programming. Big Bag dared to be weird and thoughtful, but the world simply wasn't ready. Number 17. Toonheads, 1996. Toonheads was Cartoon Network's attempt to bring a documentary flair to classic animation. The show delved into the history of Looney Tunes, Hanna-Barbera, and other vintage cartoons with behind-the-scenes trivia and themed marathons. On paper, it was a cartoon lover's dream. In practice, it exposed some of the darkest, most controversial aspects of animation history, often without a content warning. Episodes would focus on banned characters like Bosco or wartime propaganda shorts that included disturbing racial caricatures. Some nights, Toonheads would air full blocks of cartoons that had been previously shelved for offensive content. Though the show provided valuable historical context, the visuals remained unfiltered. There were episodes about animation's treatment of indigenous people, women, and other marginalized groups, all showcased using the original uncut cartoons from the era. It was raw, real, and educational, but jarring. In today's era of sensitive programming guidelines, such material would never make it to daytime TV, let alone a network geared toward children. Even streaming platforms now carry disclaimers or remove content entirely. Toonheads was ahead of its time in trying to start a conversation about cartoon history, but its blunt presentation and unedited footage would make it nearly impossible to air on modern television without severe pushback. Number 16. Courage the Cowardly Dog, 1999. At first glance, Courage the Cowardly Dog was just another wacky cartoon about a scared dog protecting his owners, but it quickly descended into one of the most nightmarish and psychologically intense children's shows ever made. From zombie-like villains to silent shape-shifting demons, Courage didn't hold back. The animation was creepy, the music was haunting, and the storytelling was drenched in existential dread. Episodes like King Ramses' Curse or The Mask dealt with fear, trauma, abuse, and isolation. There was body horror, sudden death, and unsettling silence used for emotional impact. Some episodes had almost no dialogue, letting the visuals and sound design craft deeply disturbing tales. The show managed to reflect real psychological fears under the guise of surreal comedy. As a result, it traumatized and mesmerized kids in equal measure. If pitched today, Courage would be flagged by executives for emotional instability, graphic visuals, and intense themes unfit for general audiences. Parents would protest the use of grotesque monsters and allegorical content about domestic neglect or PTSD. It's a miracle Courage ever got made, and it remains one of Cartoon Network's most artistically daring projects. But today, it would be deemed far too horrifying for children's television. Number 15. The Popeye Show, 1999. Cartoon Network's revival of classic Popeye cartoons in The Popeye Show was meant to preserve animation history. What it did instead was accidentally revive a storm of controversy. These were not the edited versions seen in syndication. These were the raw original prints, uncut, unrestored, and often racially insensitive. The show presented Popeye episodes from the 1930s and 1940s exactly as they were originally created, including their wartime propaganda. Episodes featured slurs, exaggerated foreign accents, and deeply stereotypical caricatures. Blackface gags, Axis enemy mockery, and casual violence were common. While the show provided minimal context, it lacked the robust disclaimers or historical framing that would be expected today. Many of the aired cartoons had previously been banned or heavily censored by networks for good reason. The Popeye Show was praised by animation purists but received backlash from parents and advocacy groups. Its late-night slot did little to shield Cartoon Network from criticism. In today's media landscape, these episodes would either be buried or preceded by intense cultural disclaimers. Airing them raw, as The Popeye Show did, would be out of the question. It was preservation with no filter, and the results were too problematic for modern standards. Number 14. Grim and Evil, 1999. Before Billy and Mandy, there was Grim and Evil, the original pilot series that split into two shows. This early iteration was even more grotesque and experimental than its successors. It starred Grim, a Jamaican-accented Grim Reaper, forced into servitude by two kids who bordered on sociopathic. The humor was mean, the animation warped, and the tone veered into cruel absurdity. The evil half of the show followed Hector Concarne, a brain in a jar attached to a bear with ambitions of world domination. Both halves of the series shared a love for dark comedy, body horror, and grotesque visual gags. Whether it was exploding organs, demonic possession, or mental breakdowns, Grim and Evil went for shock value at every turn. Even the background art looked disturbing, often filled with twisted landscapes and deformed characters. Though it eventually evolved into two popular franchises, this early version was intense and unsettling. The pilot lacked the balance of levity that later episodes would adopt. Grim and evil in its original form would likely be labeled as too psychologically disturbing or emotionally aggressive for today's children's programming. It was chaos packaged for kids but aimed squarely at the unfiltered ID. Number 13. Space Ghost Coast to Coast, 1994. What happens when you take a forgotten 1960s superhero and reanimate him into a deadpan talk show host who interviews real celebrities with awkward silences, absurd questions, and existential dread? You get Space Ghost Coast to Coast. One of Cartoon Network's earliest surreal adult series, this show paved the way for Adult Swim, but first aired on Cartoon Network proper. The humor was so dry it burned. Episodes often spiraled into non sequiturs, hallucinations, or surreal loop. Guests like Beck or Jim Carrey would be cut off mid-sentence as Space Ghost argued with Zorak, the praying mantis bandleader, or Moltar, the lava director. Entire episodes would feature nonsensical plots like Space Ghost chasing a fly while a guest waited in silence. It was bizarre deadpan satire that bordered on anti-humor. For modern audiences, the slow-pacing, jarring edits and absurd cruelty might read as mentally unbalanced, and airing it on a Cartoon Network for kids before any dedicated adult programming block feels unthinkable today. Space Ghost Coast to Coast helped birth alternative animation, but its unsettling tone and opaque satire would never survive the sanitized streaming era. Number 12. Freakazoid, Cartoon Network reruns, 1997. Though originally produced by Warner Bros., Freakazoid became a cult favorite thanks to reruns on Cartoon Network in the late 1990s. But let's be clear, this show was pure chaos. A superhero with the mind of a hyperactive child, Freakazoid battled villains with names like Cave Guy or Candlejack while breaking the fourth wall more often than Deadpool. Freakazoid was fast, manic, and unhinged. It parodied internet culture, absurd bureaucracy, and even its own writers. One episode featured a police chase that turned into a Broadway number. Another dissolved into a parody of a public access cooking show. The jokes were rapid-fire, packed with niche references to 1940s radio dramas, obscure pop stars, and forgotten sitcoms. Some jokes were deeply inappropriate and snuck past censors with clever innuendo. Its tone was more Mad Magazine than Saturday morning cartoons, and its unpredictability made it impossible to classify. Today, networks demand brand consistency and narrative clarity. Freakazoid offered neither. The sheer surrealism and underlying adult tone would trigger warning bells for current TV exec. It was lightning in a bottle and too wild to be bottled again. Number 11. Ed, Edd n Eddy, 1999. On the surface, Ed, Edd n Eddy was a show about three misfit boys trying to scam candy money from their suburban cul-de-sac. But under that premise was something much stranger. The show's animation style was jittery, dreamlike, and constantly shifting. The characters' behavior was often cruel, manipulative, or downright feral. Episodes could feel like fever dreams with distorted perspective and surreal logic. The show's world was childlike, yet void of adults and filled with psychological tension. Characters screamed in frustration, twitched from anxiety, and betrayed each other constantly. Episodes like Vert Ed Go and 1+1 Daxos Ed ventured into existential surrealism. Visual gags became symbols for childhood neuroses. Add to that the aggressive sound design and abrasive dialogue, and you had a show that felt more like psychological warfare than Saturday morning fun. Today, Ed, Edd n Eddy would be flagged for its bullying themes, emotional instability, and off-kilter tone. It was not just a cartoon, but a manic exploration of childhood dysfunction. And yet it was brilliant. Still, modern execs would never greenlight a show that feels this unfiltered, this raw, and this genuinely strange. Number 10. Dexter's Laboratory, Early Shorts, 1996. Dexter's Laboratory became a Cartoon Network staple, but its early uncut pilot shorts featured a sharper edge than most remember. In these first episodes, before the series found its polished tone, the humor was more aggressive, the slapstick more painful, and the innuendo more blatant. Dexter's rivalry with Dee was portrayed as near-violent. His parents were oblivious parodies, and the world often collapsed around his unchecked science. One early episode features Dexter creating a robot that nearly wipes out his entire home while his family watches TV in a hypnotized state. Another notorious short, Dial M for Monkey Barbacore, was banned outright after airing once due to thinly veiled homosexual stereotypes in a Galactus parody. In another short called Rude Removal, Dexter invents a machine that splits himself and Dee into foul-mouthed alter egos who spew censored profanity for the entire episode. While clever and subversive, these early versions of Dexter's Laboratory would raise red flags in today's children's programming environment. Network censors today would reject entire episodes outright and flag the character dynamics as emotionally unhealthy. It is a brilliant relic of boundary-pushing 90s animation, but in 2025, even the pilot would likely never see broadcast again. Number 9. Time Squad Pilot 1999. Time Squad officially launched in 2001. But its original unaired pilot premiered in late 1999, and it was far darker than the eventual series. The concept was already edgy for a children's show. A trio of time-traveling agents fixes the timeline by force, often using manipulation, intimidation, and in some cases, brute violence to force historical figures into their correct paths. The pilot leaned heavily into dystopian humor and dark comedy. The pilot depicted Abraham Lincoln refusing to free the slaves, and the team essentially scaring him into doing so. Leonardo da Vinci was shown building toilets instead of flying machines, and had to be intimidated back into greatness. These scenes were played for laughs, but the implications were grim. The animation was cruder, the tone more adult, and the dialogue far more sarcastic than the eventual show. Otto the Kid was meaner, and Larry the Robot used shock collars. Even though Time Squad would become a tamer and quirky series, the pilot was biting satire, bordering on socio-political commentary. Cartoon Network wisely sanitized it before greenlighting the full series. Today's censors would see the unaired pilot as tonally mismatched, politically risky, and psychologically aggressive. In its original form, Time Squad was closer to dark satire than kids' adventure. Number 8. Johnny Bravo 1997. Johnny Bravo was a caricature of macho stupidity, but modern audiences might not find him so funny. The show followed Johnny, a clueless, Elvis-voiced bodybuilder who constantly harassed women and got violently rejected every time. While meant to parody toxic masculinity, the series often pushed into uncomfortable territory. Johnny's antics included stalking, groping, and manipulating women, usually played for laughs. Some episodes leaned into outright sexual humor, including situations where Johnny ends up in female locker rooms or mistaken as a stripper. The early episodes were more overt with these gags, including suggestive dancing and innuendo that went far beyond what most children's cartoons dared. One infamous episode showed Johnny flirting with a minor by mistake and trying to backpedal in cartoonishly panicked fashion. Though intended as satire, Johnny Bravo's one-note joke about harassment hasn't aged well. Many today argue that younger audiences lacked the media literacy to see him as the joke. Executives now prefer characters with emotional arcs and redeeming qualities. Johnny had neither. It is unlikely a show with this premise would be approved today, and certainly not with the original edge it debuted with in the 1990s. It was bold for its time, but that time has passed. Number 7. Sheep in the Big City 2000. Pilot 1999. Technically debuting in 2000, Sheep in the Big City's pilot aired on Cartoon Network's late 1999 showcase block. The series was one of the most absurdist shows ever made for children. It followed Sheep, a non-speaking character on the run from a secret military organization that wanted to use him in a sheep-powered ray gun. The show was a barrage of fourth-wall breaks, narrator battles, and jokes about advertising and network politics. Episodes often opened with monologues ridiculing the animation industry, followed by segments that mocked consumerism, government, and language itself. The jokes were layered with puns, wordplay, and meta-references that most children wouldn't understand. Entire episodes devolved into verbal surrealism, where punchlines were deliberately anti-jokes. The enemy General Specific had a sidekick named Private Public. That kind of show. Today, executives would be baffled by how to even market this series. It did not fit the mold of educational programming nor slapstick fun. Its strange humor would alienate test audiences under the age of 10. While the show gained a cult following for its writing intelligence, it was not built for a broad demographic. Modern networks would bury it before it aired. In fact, they already did. Number 6. What a Cartoon 1995. What a Cartoon was Cartoon Network's boldest anthology experiment. It offered creator-driven short films that would serve as pilots for potential series. Some became classics like Powerpuff Girls or Johnny Bravo. Others never made it past their single broadcast. and for good reason. Many were wildly inappropriate, violent, or emotionally intense even by 90s standards. The series aired late at night and gave creators full control. One short Yucky Duck featured a foul-mouthed, washed-up cartoon duck who talked about unemployment and nervous breakdowns. Another, called The Ignoramuses, involved politically incorrect animal stereotypes. Some were overtly sexual or featured suicidal imagery masked as comedy. The visual style ranged from grotesque to borderline psychedelic. Since these were all creator-driven, there were no content filters. And it showed. What a cartoon would never happen today. Networks no longer hand control to independent animators without oversight. The unpredictability of tone, subject matter, and visual intensity would make this series impossible to greenlight. It was a playground for boundary pushing, but the boundaries have since closed in. Today's censors would pull the plug after one episode. Number 5. I Am Weasel, 1997. A spin-off of Cow and Chicken, I Am Weasel seemed like innocent fun about a brilliant weasel and his dim-witted rival, IR Baboon. But under the surface, this show was brimming with sarcasm, cruelty, and bizarre body horror. Episodes often revolved around IR being humiliated, tormented, or psychologically broken by the world around him. Even Weasel, the supposed hero, was more arrogant than admirable. The show took gleeful joy in subverting moral lessons. Characters exploded, melted, or devolved into madness. One episode featured IR being manipulated into thinking he was a squirrel, while another had a town slowly losing its grip on reality over fart joke. The animation was jagged, erratic, and often grotesque. The background characters were drawn with absurd deformities, and weird sound effects amplified the chaos. Modern audiences would not be ready for how mean-spirited and nihilistic this show could be beneath its wacky exterior. While intended as satire, it offered little redemption for its characters, and seemed to celebrate idiocy in a way that's no longer acceptable for children's programming. Today's networks demand affirming messages and clean character arcs. I Am Weasel gave us cartoon cruelty and said nothing was sacred. Number 4. Mike Lou and Og, 1999. This obscure Cartoon Network series followed three kids stranded on a fictional tropical island ruled by eccentric natives. Mike, a New York girl, tries to modernize the island, while Lou, the spoiled island princess, resents her, and Og, the local genius, invents things like plumbing and toasters. On the surface, it was quirky and harmless. In practice, it was culturally tone-deaf. The series leaned heavily on exaggerated tribal stereotypes. Island residents were drawn with cartoonishly primitive outfits, spoke in broken English, and worshipped odd superstitions. Mike was the civilized outsider who tried to teach them how to live properly. The implication of cultural superiority was uncomfortably baked into every episode. Combined with jokes about cannibalism, toilet humor, and slapstick punishments, it felt deeply outdated even then. While intended to be a fish-out-of-water comedy, Mike, Lou, and Og's framing of savages versus civilized kid doesn't fly in today's climate. The show disappeared from reruns shortly after its original run and has never been revived. In today's global media landscape, a show this dependent on colonial tropes and shallow parody would be immediately flagged as problematic, and it was. Number 3. Cow and Chicken, 1997. Cow and Chicken is perhaps the most infamous example of 90s Cartoon Network pushing the envelope to the point of breaking it. The show followed two siblings, one a giant cow, the other a tiny chicken, as they faced surreal scenarios, often involving their naked red antagonist, simply known as the Red Guy. The tone was loud, grotesque, and unapologetically weird. Episodes featured cow getting wedgies from giant pigs or chicken eating meat despite being poultry. The humor veered into bodily fluids, naked chases, and scenes that looked suspiciously like adult innuendo. The Red Guy frequently cross-dressed, strutted naked, and spanked himself on screen. One banned episode titled Buffalo Gals implied a gang of leather-clad women breaking into homes to chew carpets, a scene so loaded with innuendo it caused public backlash. In retrospect, Cow and Chicken was never really for kids. It was Looney Tunes with a warped 90s nihilism and a shocking amount of perversion. Today's TV standards would flag nearly every episode for sexual content, bathroom humor, and questionable themes. It's a miracle this show lasted as long as it did. It would never air today, not without triggering a cultural firestorm. Number 2. Two Stupid Dogs, 1993. Two Stupid Dogs was one of Cartoon Network's earliest originals and one of its crudest. The show was exactly what the title promised: two incredibly dumb dogs getting into senseless adventures. The animation style was flat and intentionally ugly, mimicking the retro look of early Hanna-Barbera, but with a meaner attitude and much dirtier joke. Episodes included farting fits, hairball gags, and uncomfortable innuendo. A recurring theme involved characters misunderstanding basic bodily functions or cultural norms. One episode was pulled after a character graphically discussed a large boil on his behind. Another showed the dogs obsessing over a big fat thing in the kitchen that was clearly a coded gag. Adult jokes flew under the radar, barely. The show also took potshots at political correctness long before that phrase was common. Characters often mocked trends, diversity, and authority. It wore its rebelliousness like a badge and even aired segments that spoofed morality PSAs. Today, such content would be labeled as insensitive, gross, and wildly off-brand for children. Two Stupid Dogs was unapologetically brainless and reveled in it. That alone makes it unairable now. Number 1. Pinky Dinky Doo, 1999. Pinky Dinky Doo was a children's educational series that aired on Cartoon Network, and it's one that many fans would rather forget. The show followed Pinky Dinky Doo, a bright young girl who would spin wild, whimsical stories to her younger brother, Tyler. While it aimed to teach kids about literacy and creative storytelling, the actual execution was often disjointed and confusing. The animation style was clumsy, with characters that seemed stiff and lifeless, despite the colorful setting. The show's approach to teaching was so in-your-face that it felt more like an interactive lesson plan than an actual fun cartoon. Episodes often included overly literal storytelling and songs that could easily be mistaken for cringe-worthy educational TV rather than a cartoon. If Pinky Dinky Doo aired today, it would undoubtedly be dismissed as outdated, lacking the charm and polish that today's animated series boast. Its educational intentions, while commendable, would likely be deemed too heavy-handed for modern children's programming, where edutainment is often subtler and more engaging. It's a strange, forgotten relic of a time when Cartoon Network tried to dip its toes into educational TV, a move that would likely be rejected by today's audience looking for more dynamic and innovative cartoons.